Family is supposed to mean safety. The person who shares your home, who knows your routines, who has been beside you long enough to know every habit, is supposed to be the last person you would ever have reason to fear. She is the one who made the meals. She is the one who knew which foods you trusted. She is the one you never once thought to watch. But for the victims in these cases, the greatest danger was already living inside the house. The husband who came home from work, the son who drank what was poured for him, the elderly resident who ate what was placed in front of her, the family who accepted the lunch invitation. None of them knew that the person preparing the food had already decided how it would end. The poison was in the drink they were handed. It was in the meal they sat down to. It was in the care they never thought to question. Today we are covering 10 women who poisoned their own families and the trust that made every one of these crimes possible. Case 1. Diane Stouty. Springfield, Missouri sits in the Ozarks Plateau, the kind of mid-sized American city where the churches fill on Sunday mornings and the neighborhoods are the sort of place where people leave their cars unlocked in the driveway. The Stouty family lived in a modest house in one of those neighborhoods. Diane Stouty was 51 years old in 2012. She had trained as a nurse. She played the organ at Redeemer Lutheran Church. She was the main earner for a household of 6, and by every visible measure, she was the kind of woman her community recognized as a reliable, church-going mother who kept her family together. Mark Stouty was 61. He had been Diane's high school sweetheart. He played guitar and sang lead in a local blues band called Messing with Destiny. He worked odd jobs. He drank. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew the household, an easy man to live with. Diane told detectives later that she hated his guts, that he threw things at her, that she had simply had enough. The marriage had been wearing down for years before 2012, long before the antifreeze appeared in the Gatorade. Their daughter Rachel was 22. She was Diane's favourite, openly and without much effort at concealment. Diane posted photographs of Rachel on Facebook constantly. She rarely mentioned her other children online. Rachel was bright, focused, and had, by the eventual account of the lead detective on the case, a quality that investigators found striking even in retrospect. She could plan. Sean Stouty was 26 and on the autism spectrum. He lived at home. He had difficulty socializing and spent most of his time in the house, which Diane found suffocating. Sarah was 24. She had graduated from Missouri State University with a degree she was not yet using. She had student loan debt that Diane did not want to absorb. The youngest daughter was 9 years old and in 4th grade. By the time the case came apart in June 2013, investigators would learn that Diane and Rachel had already decided what they intended to do about that child next. The planning began, by Rachel's later admission to police, with research. The two of them looked into poisonous plants. They looked into other methods. They arrived eventually at antifreeze because of a specific problem with commercially available antifreeze that they had identified. Most antifreeze sold in American stores contains a bittering agent designed to deter accidental ingestion. The taste is detectable. Diane and Rachel solved that problem by buying their antifreeze online from a supplier that did not add the bittering agent. The compound they were working with was ethylene glycol, the toxic component in antifreeze. In the quantities they intended to administer, it was fatal. In the quantities the body processed before death, it was difficult to detect without specific testing. Standard autopsies in the United States do not routinely screen for ethylene glycol. It requires a targeted order. Without that order, a death caused by antifreeze poisoning can present as kidney failure, as seizure activity, as any number of things that look, to an overworked county medical examiner, like a man with an unhealthy lifestyle who finally ran out of time. Mark Stouter received the antifreeze in his Gatorade. He drank it over several days. In April 2012, he began feeling unwell. The symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning include nausea, vomiting, slurred speech, and a progressive loss of alertness that can resemble intoxication. Mark already drank. The connection was easy to miss. He did not go to the hospital. Diane did not take him. On the day he died, Diane came home and found him. She called for help. The Gatorade was gone. The Greene County medical examiner noted a ring of dried blood around his mouth, which was unusual, but Mark's lifestyle was documented and the death was ruled natural causes. Diane collected $20,000 from his life insurance policy. She used it to move the family to a larger house in a better neighbourhood. Rachel had written a diary entry on June 13, 2011, nearly 2 months before Mark died. In it, she wrote that it was sad when she realised how her father would pass on in the next 2 months, that Sean, her brother, would move on shortly after, that it would be tough getting used to the changes, but that everything would work out. The diary was sitting in the house. Nobody was looking for it yet. 5 months after Mark died, Sean was poisoned. Diane told friends and family that Sean had been experiencing flu-like symptoms for 3 weeks before his death. Diarrhea, nausea, body aches, headaches. He died at home. The cause of death was attributed to his prior health issues. Diane arranged no memorial service for her son. A relative found out about Sean's death from another family member, not from Diane. The family friend Rob Mancuso from Mark's band later said that when he saw Diane after Sean died, she was behaving like she was hosting a party. There was no sadness. He thought at the time that it was just her way of grieving. He did not know that there was no grief. Sarah was poisoned next. Diane added ethylene glycol to Sarah's Coca-Cola over several days. By the accounts Diane gave to police, the reason for poisoning Sarah was that Sarah had student loans that needed to be paid, and Sarah was not working, and Diane wanted to get her out of the way. In June 2013, Sarah was taken to the hospital. She was admitted to the ICU with a brain bleed and organ failure. The doctors could not explain her condition. None of the standard tests accounted for what was happening to her. A doctor who was reviewing Sarah's case told the detective who came to the hospital that the presentation was suspicious, that he could not rule out poisoning. The nurse on Sarah's ward told the same detective that while her daughter was in intensive care, Diane had visited only a few times, had not stayed long, had joked and laughed with hospital personnel, and had told the nurse that she was planning a trip to Florida regardless of Sarah's condition. Diane was not going to cancel the vacation. On June 11, 2013, an anonymous call came into the Springfield Police Department. The caller said he believed 2 or 3 homicides had been committed in the Stouter household, connecting Mark's death, Sean's death, and Sarah's hospitalization. The caller was later identified as Jeff Sippy, the pastor at Redeemer Lutheran Church, where Diane played the organ. He had been watching the deaths accumulate and listening to the silence where grief should have been. On June 13th, an investigator went to the hospital. On June 20th, Diane was brought in for an interview. She denied it at first. Then she told detectives that Mark and Sean had been drinking antifreeze as a way to commit suicide. The detective, Neil McCamis, did not accept that. He pushed. Diane then said she was the one who had been giving it to them. She said she hated Mark, that she had just had enough. She described Sean as more than a bother, more than a pest. She described Sarah's student loans as a burden she did not want. She did not, in that initial interrogation, name Rachel. She said she had acted alone. McCamis did not believe that either. A search warrant was executed at the house. A team member found the diary. Rachel was brought in. She denied it. McCamis told her about the diary. Rachel broke. She admitted her involvement. She told investigators that her mother had brought it up and that they had discussed it. She said they had done a lot of research together. She said they had looked into poisonous plants and other methods before settling on antifreeze. She said she had argued with her mother about Sean. She had told her mother that Sean could have been placed in assisted living. Her mother had wanted him out. The plan, McCamis later revealed, was that after Sarah died, the youngest daughter, the 9-year-old in 4th grade, was to be poisoned as well because of her learning disabilities. Both women were arrested. Diane was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree assault. Rachel was charged with the same. The case against them was clean. The antifreeze had been purchased online. The diary existed. The interrogation tapes existed. Samples from Sean's body, once tested specifically for ethylene glycol, showed it clearly. Sarah was alive, but had sustained permanent neurological damage. She would never fully recover. She moved into assisted living. The youngest daughter was placed in foster care. Rachel pleaded guilty in May 2015 to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree assault as part of a deal that required her to testify against her mother. She was sentenced in March 2016 to 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 42.5 years. At sentencing, she turned to Sarah and said she was sorry she could not find the courage to stand up for what was right. Diane entered an Alford plea in January 2016, acknowledging that prosecutors had sufficient evidence to convict her while not formally admitting guilt. She had said in a later interview that she said what she was told to say and that there was more to the story than people knew. She suggested her husband had been associated with dangerous people and that someone might have poisoned him independently. There is no evidence to support this account. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Diane Stouter is currently held at the Women's Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Vandalia, Missouri. Rachel Stouter is held at the same facility. Sarah Stouter lives in assisted living. The youngest daughter grew up in foster care. Mark Stouter and Sean Stouter are buried in Springfield. The house Diane bought with Mark's life insurance money has been sold. The church where she played the organ on Sunday mornings eventually moved forward without her. What is left in the public record of this case is a specific, quiet image. A woman sitting at a church organ on Sunday mornings, someone her congregation trusted with the music of worship, who had in the weeks prior added antifreeze to her husband's sports drink and was waiting to see how long it would take. She was not reckless. She was not impulsive. She bought untraceable antifreeze from the internet. She researched poison methods. She kept her favourite daughter beside her as a partner. She did it over months, in a house full of people who trusted her with their food. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Diane Stouty bought untraceable antifreeze online and poisoned her husband and son while planning a Florida vacation. And the only reason she was caught was an anonymous call from her church pastor. The next case is Stacey Caster, a woman who had already buried 2 husbands and was about to feed her own daughter a lethal cocktail by teaspoon to keep the secret. Case 2, Stacey Caster. The morning of August 22, 2005 began the way a lot of mornings in Liverpool, New York begin. Liverpool is a suburb north of Syracuse, in Onondaga County, where the houses sit on quiet residential streets and the summers are short and the winters are long. Stacey Caster called 911 that morning from her home. She told the dispatcher that her husband had locked himself in the bedroom and had not come out for more than 24 hours. She asked the dispatcher to send help. When paramedics arrived and broke through the bedroom door, they found David Caster, 48 years old, stretched across the bed. He was dead. There was vomit on the mattress and on the floor. On the nightstand beside the bed, there was a glass of green liquid. Sticking out from beneath the bed frame was a container of antifreeze. The scene looked at first like a man who had decided to end his own life. David had seemed depressed. Stacey told the officers. He had been drinking. She said she had heard nothing unusual. She said she had not tried to open the door when he failed to come out. The investigators processed the scene. They were not immediately satisfied. There was something wrong with the picture. David's fingerprints were not on the glass. They were not on the antifreeze container. Stacey's fingerprints were on the glass. In the kitchen trash, wrapped in a bag, there was a turkey baster. The baster tested positive for ethylene glycol, the toxic component of antifreeze. It also had David Caster's DNA on it. The working theory that emerged was that Stacey had used the baster to deliver the antifreeze to her husband without his knowledge, likely by slipping it into food or drinks, and had then staged the scene to make it appear that he had chosen to die. Stacey Caster had been married before. Her first husband, Michael Wallace, had died in 2000. He was 38 years old. His death had been ruled a heart attack. He had left behind 2 daughters, Ashley, who was 12 at the time of his death, and Bree, who was younger. Stacey had remarried, bringing David Caster into the household. Ashley Wallace grew up with her mother and stepfather in the house in Liverpool. She was, by her own later description, her mother's best friend. Stacey had told Ashley that. Ashley had believed it. Stacey Castor had been born Stacey Daniels in Clay, New York in 1967. Her mother, Judy Eaton, later described a daughter who had once envisioned great things for herself. Little of her early life entered the public record before her later infamy overwhelmed it. What is known is that she married Michael Wallace on April 7, 1990, when she was 22 years old. Michael was a working man, not wealthy, and the marriage produced 2 daughters. Ashley was born in 1988, before the marriage, and Bree came after. Michael Wallace died in 2000. He was 38. The death was ruled a heart attack, and Stacey collected on his life insurance. She moved on quickly. She met David Castor and married him. The household in Liverpool became the home where Ashley and Bree grew up alongside their stepfather, and where Stacey presented herself to the neighbourhood as a woman who had endured an early loss and rebuilt a life around her daughters. There is a detail in the case record that does not get much attention, but that sits at the edge of everything that followed. The Onondaga County District Attorney, William Fitzpatrick, noted during the trial proceedings that investigators had considered whether Stacey might also have been responsible for the death of her own father, Jerry Daniels, who died on February 22, 2002, shortly after his daughter had visited him in hospital, where he had been admitted for a minor lung complaint. Castor was the executor of her father's estate. Her first husband's family later told investigators they believed Stacey had brought an open can of soda to her father during that hospital visit. No charges were ever filed in connection with Jerry Daniels' death. The suspicion was noted, examined, and ultimately set aside because there was insufficient evidence to pursue it. It sits in the margin of the case as an unanswered question about how far back the pattern actually began. Investigators from the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department were working the David Castor case when they began to ask questions about Michael Wallace. Investigators reached out to Cayuga County, where Wallace had died, and found that the 2 cases shared a pattern: a husband, flu-like symptoms, a rapid death, a wife who had collected on life insurance. Stacey had collected on David's estate and insurance as well, having forged his will to ensure that his son from a previous relationship received nothing. 3 months after David died, investigators in Onondaga County contacted Cayuga County about Wallace. They described certain similarities. Michael Wallace's body was exhumed. The examination found oxalate crystals in his kidney tissue. Those crystals are produced by the body in response to ethylene glycol ingestion and do not break down for years. They do not appear naturally. Michael Wallace had been poisoned with antifreeze. His death was reclassified as a homicide. At this point, in September 2007, investigators were preparing to move against Stacey Castor. She became aware that the pressure was building. Ashley was starting her first day of college when 2 detectives arrived at the campus and told her that her father had been murdered and that her mother was a suspect. Ashley called her mother. The call was recorded on a police wiretap. Stacey asked Ashley what the detectives had said. Then she suggested they get together and have a drink, because they had both had a hard day. Ashley agreed. She drove to her mother's house in Liverpool. Stacey made her a drink. Ashley had a hangover the next morning, but went to school. She came home that afternoon. Stacey invited her to have another drink. Ashley drank it. She described it later as having a nasty taste. She had not wanted to finish it, but she did. 17 hours later, Ashley's younger sister Bree found Ashley unconscious in her bed and would not wake up. Bree demanded that someone call for help. Stacey called 911. Ashley was taken to the hospital. She was in a coma. Beside her bed, there was a typed document that Stacey later claimed was a suicide note. The note was 750 words long. In it, the author confessed to having poisoned both Michael Wallace and David Castor. It described guilt and grief. It read as though Ashley had been living with the knowledge of what she had done and could no longer bear it. The word antifreeze appeared 4 times in the note. All 4 times it was spelled anti-free. What the note was designed to do, beyond framing Ashley for the 2 murders, was provide an explanation that closed every remaining question about David Castor's death and Michael Wallace's death simultaneously. A confession from a living person, one who had been close enough to both men to have had opportunity, would have made the case against Stacey disappear entirely. The forged note did not just protect Stacey from prosecution, it was also intended to send her daughter to prison for the rest of her life. Ashley was 20 years old. She had just started college. She had told her mother about the detective's visit. Stacey had listened, assessed the threat, and within the same day had begun administering a fatal dose of drugs and alcohol to the daughter she called her best friend. The mechanics of what Stacey did across those 17 hours require a particular kind of focus to take in. She did not act in a single moment of panic. She sat in the house with Ashley, unconscious in her bedroom, and continued the administration of vodka and prescription pills by teaspoon across the better part of a day. She wrote the note, or had already written it, and placed it beside Ashley's bed. She managed the timing carefully enough that when she eventually called 911, Ashley was deep enough into the overdose to be convincingly close to death, without having actually crossed over. The margin she was working within was the margin between her daughter being alive enough to be revived and dead enough to be credible as a suicide. She called when she judged the moment was right. Bree had already found Ashley and was pushing for help to be called, which may have compressed Stacey's timeline. Ashley survived. Whether that outcome was part of Stacey's calculation or whether she had misjudged the dose is something the trial record does not resolve definitively. Investigators set up cameras outside the Custer house during the period when Ashley was being poisoned. They tracked Stacey's movements. They had the note. They had the computers. It did not take long to establish that the note had been composed on the Custer family computer at a time when Ashley was at school and Stacey was at home. The misspelling of antifreeze as anti-free appeared 4 times in the document. During an interview with investigators, Stacey said anti-free before catching herself. She said she had been about to say something else. Investigators had the recordings. They had both drafts of the document saved on the hard drive, confirming that Stacey had revised the note before printing it. Ashley had not written it. Ashley had not been in the house when it was written. Stacey had typed a confession, attributed it to her daughter, poured her daughter a cocktail of vodka and prescription pills, administered over 17 hours by teaspoon while Ashley was unconscious, and called 911 when she calculated that Ashley was close enough to death for the story to hold. Ashley survived. Her recovery was slow. What she had to process once she was out of the hospital was not only that her mother had tried to kill her, but that her mother had also killed both of her fathers. She told a reporter afterward that Stacey had been her best friend. She said Stacey had told her that directly. She said she would have done anything for her. She said her mother had decided to kill her instead. Stacey Custer was arrested on September 14, 2007. She was charged with second-degree murder in the death of David Custer, attempted second-degree murder in the poisoning of Ashley, and forgery of David's will. She was not charged with the death of Michael Wallace, though evidence of his poisoning was admitted at trial to establish a pattern. The prosecution was handled by Onondaga County District Attorney William Fitzpatrick and Chief Assistant District Attorney Christine Garvey. The defense was led by Charles Keller. The trial opened in January 2009. Stacey Custer took the stand in her own defense. She was calm. She was controlled. She repeated, in the face of the forensic evidence, the wiretap recordings, the computer records, and the exhumation findings, that she had done nothing. She maintained that Ashley had poisoned both men and had then tried to take her own life in a crisis of guilt. She held her composure through a cross-examination by Fitzpatrick that lasted hours. She did not waver. 9 of the 12 jurors later spoke to reporters after the verdict. They said they found almost nothing of her testimony believable. They said they focused on the timeline and the opportunities she had. The turkey baster with ethylene glycol and David's DNA, the glass with her fingerprints and not his, the note written while her daughter was in class, the misspelling that matched her own speech pattern. Fitzpatrick, in his closing argument, told the jury that Stacey Custer had not made one big mistake. She had made a series of mistakes. The turkey baster in the trash, the fingerprints on the glass without David's, the misspelling that she repeated aloud in her own interview, the computer timestamps that placed the note's composition in Ashley's absence. Each one individually might have been explainable, Together they formed a chain that the prosecution argued no reasonable interpretation of coincidence could account for. The defence's counter, that Ashley had written the note and had poisoned the men, required the jury to accept that a girl who had been 12 years old when her father died had somehow administered antifreeze to him without detection, had then gone on to kill her stepfather 6 years later using the same method, and had then, in a crisis of guilt, attempted to take her own life using a drug and alcohol combination that her mother had nothing to do with. The jury was in deliberations for 16 hours over 4 days. When they came back, the verdicts covered everything. The jury deliberated for 16 hours across 4 days. On February 5, 2009, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Second-degree murder of David Castor, attempted second-degree murder of Ashley Wallace, forgery. Stacey Castor sat with her eyes closed as the verdicts were read. There was a loud gasp from the front row of the courtroom, where Ashley sat with her younger sister and members of both the Wallace and Castor families. Judge Joseph Fahey sentenced Stacey Castor to 51 years to life in prison. Before pronouncing the sentence, he addressed the courtroom. He said that in 34 years in the criminal justice system, as a lawyer and then as a judge, he had seen serial killers, contract killers, killers of every variety and stripe. He said this case was among the most reprehensible he had encountered. The specific act of poisoning a daughter and then writing a false confession in her name and leaving it beside her unconscious body was the part of the case that he named directly. Stacey Castor was transferred to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in Westchester County. She never admitted to anything. In interviews given after the trial, she continued to say she had not killed Michael Wallace, had not killed David Castor, and had not tried to kill her daughter. She said this without variation. Ashley Wallace, in her own interview, said that her mother had been her best friend, that she had believed that completely, and that her mother had then made a choice that Ashley still could not fully process. She said she would have done anything for her. She said she had. She said she nearly died because of it. On the morning of June 11, 2016, Stacey Castor was found unresponsive in her cell at Bedford Hills. She could not be revived. She was 48 years old. An autopsy found no signs of foul play. The cause was determined to be a heart attack. She had served 7 years of her sentence. She died without admitting to a single one of the deaths her fingerprints, her DNA, her computer records, her speech patterns, and 2 exhumed bodies confirmed she had caused. Ashley Wallace rebuilt her life after the trial. She gave a small number of interviews in the years that followed, and then largely stepped back from public attention. Bree grew up. The house in Liverpool was eventually sold. Michael Wallace is buried in Cayuga County. David Castor is buried in Onondaga County. Jerry Daniels, Stacey's father, is buried somewhere in New York, his death still officially unresolved and sitting in the margin of a case that was already large enough without it. The turkey baster, the glass, the 2 drafts of the suicide note on the family hard drive, the pink container of antifreeze found under the bed, the 17 hours of teaspoon by teaspoon, all of it sits in the case file of a woman who told the world that her daughter had done it, and then sat in a courtroom with her eyes closed and waited for the jury to decide who they believed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stacey Castor poisoned 2 husbands and then spent 17 hours trying to kill her daughter with a forged suicide note beside her bed, and she died in prison 7 years later, still denying everything. The next case is Nanny Doss, a grandmother in Alabama who giggled through her confession and had been poisoning husbands and family members with rat poison for 30 years before anyone looked twice. Case 3. Nanny Doss. Nanny Doss was born Nancy Hazel on November 4, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama, the kind of small rural community where the nearest town was a long walk and the days were shaped by farm work and church and the particular silence of the rural American South in the early 20th century. Her father James was a controlling man who pulled his children out of school to work the family farm. He drank, he gambled. Nanny later told investigators he had forced her into prostitution to cover his debts. When she was 7 years old, she suffered a serious head injury on a train, striking her head hard against the metal seat in front of her. She had headaches and blackouts, and episodes of depression for years afterward. She found her escape in her mother's romance magazines, the kinds that published stories about idealized love, devoted husbands, perfect domestic happiness. She read those magazines constantly. She built, in her mind, a picture of what her life was supposed to look like. It never quite matched the men she actually married. She married for the first time in 1921. She was 16 years old. Charlie Braggs was her husband. They had 4 children together. 2 of those children died in infancy, under circumstances that were never fully investigated at the time. Charlie Braggs eventually left her, taking their eldest daughter with him. He later told investigators that he had left because he was afraid of her. He had noticed things he could not name. He had simply understood, on some level, that staying was dangerous. He was one of the few men in Nanny Doss's orbit who made it out. She married again, and again. The pattern was always the same. She would find a new husband, often through the Lonely Hearts columns in newspapers and romance magazines, sections where single people advertised for companionship. She was warm, she was cheerful, she cooked elaborate meals and kept a clean house and presented herself as exactly the kind of wife the men who answered those advertisements were hoping to find. She was also, from the moment she decided a marriage had run its course, quietly moving toward a resolution. The resolution was arsenic. Sometimes it was rat poison. She administered it in food and coffee, in the portions she cooked herself and served to the people sitting across the table from her. Frank Harrelson was her second husband. He drank heavily and was physically violent with her. He died in 1945. Arlie Lanning was her third husband. He died in 1952. His mother came to live with Nanny shortly after his death, and she died as well not long after. Richard Morton was her fourth husband. He also died. Each death was recorded at the time as natural causes. Each man had been ill before he died, with symptoms that looked like flu or gastrointestinal distress or cardiac trouble. Arsenic poisoning in its chronic form, administered in small doses over time, produces nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and a deterioration that can mimic a dozen other conditions. In the 1940s and 1950s, in rural Alabama and Oklahoma and Kansas and North Carolina, there was not always a pathologist nearby asking the right questions. In 1953, Nanny's mother fell and broke a hip. Nanny travelled to care for her. Her mother died a few months later. One of Nanny's sisters died not long after, following contact with Nanny. 2 of her grandchildren died in infancy, at times when Nanny was present and caring for them. Investigators later concluded that she had smothered some of her family members rather than poisoning them, as exhumations of some of the bodies showed no arsenic. The full scope of what she had done across 3 decades is not precisely known. Alabama law enforcement believed she had killed as many as 11 or 12 people. She collected more than $7,000 in life insurance proceeds across the deaths of her husbands and daughters. Her final husband was Samuel Doss. She married him in 1953 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Samuel was a strict, frugal man who disapproved of Nanny's romance magazines and her spending habits. He controlled the household finances. He limited her leisure time. The couple separated for a period, then reunited. Shortly after the reunion, Samuel became severely ill after eating prunes Nanny had prepared. He was hospitalized and recovered. He came home. He died 2 weeks later, in October 1954. The attending physician, a doctor named Schwelbein, had treated Samuel during his hospitalization and had not been satisfied with the recovery. When Samuel died at home, Schwelbein refused to sign the death certificate without an autopsy. The autopsy found a massive quantity of arsenic in Samuel's stomach, enough to kill him several times over. Nanny Doss was brought in for questioning in November 1954. The interrogation lasted several days. She was cooperative. She was friendly. She smiled. She laughed. When detectives asked her about her husbands, she sometimes giggled while explaining how they had died. The journalists who covered her arrest and subsequent confession used the word giggling in their dispatches repeatedly, and the nickname Giggling Granny entered the public record and stayed there. She eventually confessed to killing 4 of her husbands. She denied killing any of her family members, maintaining throughout every interview that she had never harmed her blood kin. Authorities exhumed the bodies of several of her husbands and her mother. All 4 confirmed husbands and her mother showed arsenic in their remains. The state of Oklahoma tried her for the murder of Samuel Doss alone. The prosecution did not need to reach back through decades of deaths to secure a conviction. The arsenic was in Samuel's body. She had prepared his food. She had access to the poison. She had collected on his insurance. She was found guilty of murder in May 1955 and sentenced to life in prison. She was 50 years old. The states of North Carolina, Kansas, and Alabama each filed additional charges against her, but Oklahoma retained jurisdiction and the other cases were never separately tried. Nanny Doss spent her remaining years at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She continued to be cheerful with the staff and other inmates. She gave several interviews to journalists and maintained the same warm, pleasant manner that had apparently made her such a sought-after companion through 5 marriages. She was diagnosed with leukemia in the early 1960s. She died on June 2, 1965. She was 59 years old. She had been in prison for 10 years. Life magazine, which had been running feature articles on ordinary American families throughout the 1950s and 1960s, had published sympathetic coverage of women in Nanny's general position during the years she was active. The cultural moment she moved through was one in which a cheerful, church-adjacent widow who cooked and cleaned and sought companionship through the newspaper columns was exactly the kind of woman no one looked at twice. She understood that. She used it. The romance magazines she had read since childhood had given her the vocabulary of devotion and domestic warmth, and she deployed that vocabulary as a surface behind which she had been administering rat poison to the men at her table for 3 decades. The giggling, the detectives who interviewed her later said, was not nerves. She seemed, by every account from the interrogation room, to find the whole thing genuinely amusing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nanny Doss killed across 4 states over 3 decades and was only caught because one doctor refused to sign a death certificate, by which point she had already buried 4 husbands and several of her own children. The next case is Amy Archer Gilligan, who ran a nursing home in Connecticut and was buying arsenic by the ounce while her elderly residents updated their wills in her favour. Case 4. Amy Archer Gilligan. In the early years of the 20th century, the town of Windsor, Connecticut, was the kind of quiet New England community where a charitable church-going widow running a home for elderly people was regarded as a pillar of the neighbourhood. Amy Archer Gilligan was that widow. She was small, soft-spoken, and known to her community as Sister Amy. She donated to the church building fund. She attended services regularly. She was described by the residents of Windsor as a diminutive woman of profound kindness, someone who had dedicated her life to caring for people who had no one else. The Archer Home for the Elderly and Infirm sat on Prospect Street in Windsor Centre. By the time investigators finally entered the building in 1916, they had begun to believe it was something closer to a processing facility. Amy Duggan was born in Connecticut in 1868, the 8th of 10 children. She married James Archer in 1897. The couple took their first caregiving work in 1901, hired as live-in caretakers for an elderly widower named John Seymour in Newington. When Seymour died in 1904, his heirs converted the property into a boarding house for the elderly and allowed the Archers to stay on and run it. In 1907, when the Seymour family sold the house, Amy and James moved to Windsor and used their savings to buy the property on Prospect Street. They opened it as a private care home for elderly and infirm residents. James Archer died in 1910 of what was recorded as Bright's disease, a general term for kidney failure. Amy had taken out an insurance policy on him shortly before his death. The benefit allowed her to continue operating the home on her own, which she did, with her young daughter Mary in the house alongside her. The business model Amy had developed was unusual for the time. Residents paid a flat fee to enter the Archer home, often transferring a significant portion of their savings or assets to Amy in exchange for guaranteed lifetime care. Some of them, under Amy's guidance, also updated their wills. A number of those wills named Amy Archer as a beneficiary. The arrangement was not, on its face, illegal. Elderly people in the early 20th century had limited options. The Archer home offered them shelter and care. What they did not know was that the length of their stay was, in a number of cases, already being determined by the woman who was cooking their meals. Amy married for the second time in 1913. Her new husband was Michael Gilligan, a widower with 4 adult sons. He had money. He died on February 20th, 1914, approximately 8 months after the wedding. The cause of death listed was gastritis. Amy inherited his estate. A Windsor man named Carlin Gosley wrote obituaries for the local paper as a sideline. He had been writing brief death notices for residents of the Archer home for several years, and by 1914 he had begun to keep count. The number was troubling. He went to the pharmacy registers, which Connecticut law required every drugstore to maintain as records of poison purchases. He found Amy Archer's name in the registers of W.H.H. Mason's Pharmacy on Broad Street, appearing multiple times, each time purchasing arsenic in significant quantities. Her stated reason was always the same: rats. She had a rat problem at the Archer home. Gosley brought his findings to a local newspaper, which began to investigate. The Windsor Police and the Connecticut State Police opened an inquiry. The body of Franklin Andrews, a resident who had died on May 30th, 1914, was exhumed. Andrews had been 60 years old, somewhat disabled, and had been doing odd jobs and errands around the Archer home in exchange for reduced fees. He had been close to his family and had written letters home regularly. His sister Nellie Pierce had noticed that some of his correspondence mentioned Amy pressing him for money. His stomach contents were examined. The arsenic found in his body was later described by a prosecutor's medical witness as enough to kill half a dozen strong men. 4 other bodies were exhumed. All 5 showed traces of arsenic or strychnine. Local merchants testified that Amy had been purchasing arsenic regularly in amounts far exceeding what a rat problem would require. 10 ounces of arsenic was recovered in records connected to the period just before Michael Gilligan's death. 10 ounces is enough to kill more than 100 people. Amy had told the pharmacy she needed it for rats and bedbugs. Investigators estimated that of the 48 deaths recorded at the Archer home over roughly 5 years of operation, approximately 20 were potentially the result of poisoning. The Hartford Courant covering the investigation used the phrase "murder factory." Amy Archer Gilligan was arrested on May 8, 1916. She was charged with 5 counts of murder. Her trial opened in Hartford in June 1917. The defence attempted several arguments. One centred on the possibility that arsenic found in exhumed bodies could have come from embalming fluid. Connecticut had banned arsenical embalming agents in 1908, but the defence argued some undertakers might still have been using them illegally, which would contaminate tissue samples. A doctor named King testified for the defence and suggested that Amy had been the victim of a neighbourhood conspiracy driven by personal animosity. He described her as a victim of foul persecution. The prosecution called 53 witnesses. It called the pharmacy records. It called the exhumation findings. It called the merchants who had sold her the arsenic. It called neighbours who had watched the deaths accumulate. After 4 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on the single count of first-degree murder of Franklin Andrews. Judge Gardner Green sentenced her to death by hanging. Amy appealed. The Connecticut Supreme Court of Errors granted her a new trial in 1918 on a procedural technicality. At the second trial, in 1919, she entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge of second-degree murder. Her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She was transferred to the Connecticut State Prison in Wethersfield. In 1924, Amy experienced what prison records described as a series of nervous fits. She was declared temporarily insane and transferred to the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane in Middletown. It was, by a particular irony, the same institution where her brother John had been committed in 1902. She spent the remaining 38 years of her life there. She never testified at either of her trials. She never gave a press interview. She made no public statement about anything she had done or was alleged to have done. She simply lived in the hospital, growing older, until she died on April 23, 1962, at the age of 88. The cultural afterlife of the Archer Gilligan case is one of the stranger footnotes in American crime history. A playwright named Joseph Kesselring had heard about the case as a boy growing up in Connecticut. Years later, he travelled back to research it, examining court records and newspaper archives. He then wrote a stage play about two charming elderly sisters who poison lonely old gentlemen out of a misguided sense of kindness. The play was called Arsenic and Old Lace. It opened on Broadway in 1941 and ran for 4 years. Frank Capra adapted it into a film in 1944, starring Cary Grant. The film is still shown on television. The comedy that Kesselring extracted from the case of a woman who had poisoned her husband, her residence, and anyone else whose estate she could inherit has made Amy Archer Gilligan, without her name attached, one of the most culturally referenced killers of the 20th century. The Archer home on Prospect Street in Windsor still exists as a building. The pharmacy where Amy purchased her arsenic is long gone. The residents who died in the upstairs rooms of that quiet New England house, the elderly men and women who had paid for guaranteed lifetime care and received a shortened version of it, are buried in cemeteries across Connecticut. Most of them have no one left who remembers their names. What stays in the public record is the image of a small, soft-spoken woman buying arsenic by the ounce at the local pharmacy and telling the pharmacist it was for the rats, while upstairs in the Archer home, the residents were eating the meals she had prepared and writing letters home about how kind she was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Amy Archer Gilligan poisoned so many residents that investigators believed 20 of the 48 deaths at her home were murders, and her case eventually inspired a Broadway comedy. The next case is Lynn Turner, a Georgia 911 dispatcher who used antifreeze to kill a police officer husband and a firefighter boyfriend 6 years apart, and collected on both insurance policies. Case 5. Lynn Turner. On the morning of March 3, 1995, Lynn Turner came home to her house in Cobb County, Georgia, and found her husband dead in their bedroom. Morris Glenn Turner was 31 years old. He was a Cobb County police officer. He had been feeling unwell for several days before his death, had gone to the emergency room on March 2nd, complaining of nausea and flu-like symptoms, had been treated and discharged, and had come home. The next morning, he was gone. The Cobb County medical examiner reviewed the case. Glenn had not led a particularly healthy lifestyle. He drank. He had been under stress. The cause of death was recorded as an irregular heartbeat. Lynn collected on his life insurance policy and his police pension. The total she received came to more than $150,000. 4 days after Glenn's funeral, she moved in with the man she had been having an affair with for the better part of 3 years. Lynn Turner was born Julia Lynn Womack on July 13, 1968. She had been adopted as an infant by a couple in Cumming, Georgia, in Forsyth County, north of Atlanta. Her adoptive parents divorced when she was 5. Her mother remarried. Lynn did not get along with her stepfather. As a teenager, she had substance abuse problems serious enough that she was admitted to a treatment clinic in Atlanta. By the time she was in her early 20s, she was working as a 911 dispatcher for Cobb County, fielding emergency calls in the same county where she would eventually need to be investigated for murder. She met Glenn Turner in 1991. He was a police officer. She pursued him, by the later account of people who knew them both. They married in August 1992. The marriage was in difficulty almost from the beginning. Lynn spent more money than Glenn made. The couple were sleeping in separate bedrooms within a year of the wedding. Lynn had already begun an affair with Randy Thompson, a firefighter from Forsyth County. Glenn knew his marriage was in trouble. He did not know about the affair. In the early months of 1995, he told 2 of his colleagues and close friends that he was planning to move out. He had a specific date in mind. The weekend of March 3, 1995, was when he intended to leave. He also told those same colleagues something else. He told them, on separate occasions, that if he ended up dead, Lynn would probably be the one responsible. He said this plainly, not dramatically, in the way a man says something he half believes but cannot quite prove. He had been watching her. He had felt something in the house that he could not name. He told his friends, and then he went home, and 4 days before his planned move, he went to the emergency room, feeling like he had the flu, and the next morning, Lynn came home and found him. Randy Thompson moved into the house where Glenn had lived within 4 days of the funeral. He had been sleeping with Lynn while Glenn was alive. Now he was the man in the house, and Lynn had $150,000 and a dead husband and a life that had, by every visible measure, rearranged itself with remarkable efficiency. Thompson was a Forsyth County firefighter. He was 32 years old. He had a $100,000 life insurance policy, though Lynn would later discover it had lapsed without her knowledge. He had also, in the years since moving in with Lynn, fathered 2 children with her. They were not married, but they functioned as a household. Lynn called herself his common-law wife. Thompson apparently trusted her completely. In January 2001, Randy Thompson began feeling unwell. He went to the emergency room on January 21st, complaining of a stomachache and persistent vomiting. He was treated and released. Lynn made him some jello when he came home. A friend of Thompson's called to check on him the following day and found him breathing hard and dizzy and vomiting again. The friend called back the next morning and received no answer. Firefighters broke down Thompson's apartment door. He was dead. He was 32 years old. The Forsyth County medical examiner recorded the cause of death as an irregular heartbeat, the same cause of death recorded for Glenn Turner 6 years earlier. Thompson's mother read the obituary notice. She contacted a relative and mentioned that her son's death sounded very similar to the death she had heard about years earlier, the death of a Cobb County police officer who had also died young with an irregular heartbeat and who had also been involved with Lynn Turner. She had heard things. She made a phone call. By the summer of 2001, 2 separate investigations had been opened. Cobb County Police were reviewing Glenn Turner's death. Forsyth County Police had called in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation on Randy Thompson's. The GBI pulled blood and urine samples from Thompson's body. A toxicologist found ethylene glycol, the same compound, the same method. Thompson's body had confirmed antifreeze poisoning. Investigators ordered Glenn Turner's body exhumed. The exhumation took place in July 2001. Tissue samples were tested. Oxalate crystals were found in the kidney tissue, the same markers that had been found in Thompson's organs. The Cobb County medical examiner amended Glenn Turner's death certificate. The cause of death was changed from irregular heartbeat to ethylene glycol toxicity. A homicide determination followed in June 2002. Lynn Turner was arrested and charged with the murder of her husband on November 1, 2002. She had been a 911 dispatcher, the person residents of Cobb County called when something terrible was happening, the voice of emergency services. And she had, in the years before and after that job, been adding antifreeze to her partner's food and waiting. The method she used relied on a specific property of ethylene glycol. It is sweet. It has almost no detectable taste in the right dilution. It can be added to jello, to sweet tea, to soup, to a bowl of food prepared by the woman who is sharing the house with you. Both men had received it that way. Investigators concluded. Glenn had eaten green jello that Lynn prepared for him after he came home from the emergency room on March 2nd. He was dead the following morning. Randy Thompson had eaten a grilled cheese sandwich and tea that Lynn gave him for lunch on the day before he died. A friend he spoke to that afternoon said he had been feeling better. By the following morning he was gone. In both cases the poison was administered in food or drink prepared by Lynn. In both cases the men presented at the emergency room with flu-like symptoms and were sent home. In both cases Lynn was the last person to see them alive. In both cases Lynn collected money. There was one additional detail that investigators retrieved. Before Glenn died, Lynn had called a local animal shelter and asked about the effects of ethylene glycol on animals. She said she was concerned about her pets. The shelter staff gave her information about ethylene glycol toxicity in animals, the sweet taste, the way pets were drawn to it, the speed of the damage. Lynn thanked them and ended the call. She made the calls sometime in the weeks before Glenn's death. The first trial, for the murder of Glenn Turner, opened in April 2004 in Houston County, Georgia. The original venue had been Marietta in Cobb County, but a judge ordered it moved after determining that an impartial jury could not be seated locally. The prosecution had no direct evidence. No one had seen Lynn add anything to Glenn's food. There was no recording, there was no confession. The case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence, which the prosecution argued was overwhelming in its pattern. 2 men, identical cause of death, 6 years apart. Both poisoned with an unusual compound that does not appear naturally in the human body. Both presenting with identical symptoms before dying. Both sending Lynn money. Both connected only to each other through their relationship with the same woman. The jury heard the evidence for 3 weeks and returned a guilty verdict on May 14, 2004. Lynn was sentenced to life in prison. She appealed. The Georgia Supreme Court denied the appeal and wrote in its decision that there was a logical connection between the Thompson murder and the murder of Lynn's husband that made the similar transaction evidence admissible. The court noted that both men went to the hospital complaining of flu-like symptoms before dying, that both died of the unique cause of antifreeze poisoning, that Lynn was the last person to see either man alive, that both died soon after Lynn served them food, and that Lynn had financial problems before the deaths of both men and collected substantial money from each. The court affirmed the conviction. The second trial, for the murder of Randy Thompson, began in January 2007. Forsyth County had difficulty seating an impartial jury as well. The trial was moved twice, eventually landing in Whitfield County in northwest Georgia, though the location was kept secret until mid-February 2007. Lynn was now facing the death penalty. Forsyth County District Attorney Penny Penn sought execution for Thompson's murder. The trial lasted 12 days. The evidence presented included Thompson's toxicology results, the pattern connecting his death to Glenn's, testimony from the friend who had spoken to Thompson hours before his death and found him deteriorating, and the insurance information showing that Thompson's primary policy had lapsed without Lynn's knowledge, meaning she had received only $36,000 rather than the $100,000 she had presumably expected. The jury convicted her on March 24, 2007. At sentencing, the jury did not choose death. Lynn's mother, Helen Gregory, pleaded for her daughter's life during the sentencing hearing. The jury sentenced Lynn to a second life term without the possibility of parole. She was transferred to Metro State Prison for Women in Atlanta, where she was already serving her first life sentence for Glenn Turner's death. Glenn Turner's family and Randy Thompson's family had watched 2 separate trials across 3 years. Thompson's sister, Brandy McNeil, said after his death that the family had not been allowed to have contact with Lynn's 2 children by Thompson, and that they were worried for them. Helen Gregory, Lynn's mother, maintained throughout both trials and after that her daughter was innocent. She said to reporters that she believed Lynn could not have done what the jury said she had done. She did not change her position. On August 30, 2010, Lynn Turner was found unresponsive in her cell at Metro State Prison at 6:55 in the morning. Prison medical staff and emergency services responded and could not revive her. She was 42 years old. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation conducted an autopsy. The chief medical examiner, Dr. Chris Sperry, reported that the cause of death was the toxic effects of propranolol, a blood pressure medication that Lynn had been prescribed and that was found in her blood at a lethal level, far above the prescribed dosage. The manner of death was classified as suicide. She had accumulated enough of her prescribed medication to produce a fatal overdose and had taken it all. She did not leave a statement. She had not, in any interview or court appearance, across the years between her arrest and her death, admitted to poisoning either man. She said in the early proceedings that she had not done it. She maintained that position. She died maintaining it, in the same way that Stacey Caster died maintaining it, and in the same way that Diane Stouter, within months of her own guilty plea, was already walking her confession back in interviews and suggesting that dangerous people her husband knew might have been responsible. The Cobb County officers who had been Glenn's colleagues and close friends, the 2 men to whom he had said that if something happened to him, Lynn was probably responsible, were still alive and working when the convictions came through. They had told investigators about Glenn's warning from the beginning. They had waited 8 years from his death to see it confirmed in a Houston County courtroom. Glenn Turner's mother had watched her son be buried as a man who had died of a heart attack and had spent 6 years knowing, without being able to prove it, that something was wrong. Randy Thompson's family had gone through the same process on a shorter timeline, watching the investigation open and the trials proceed and the second guilty verdict come in. The 2 children Lynn had with Randy Thompson were in the custody of Lynn's mother when she died. Thompson's family had been unable to make contact with them. What those children were told about their parents, or when, or by whom, is not part of the public record. Lynn Turner is buried in Georgia. Glenn Turner is buried in Georgia. Randy Thompson is buried in Georgia. 3 people, 2 of them murdered, and 1 a convicted double murderer who took her own life, all within a geographic radius of a few counties in North Georgia, all connected by a woman who had understood something specific about antifreeze, that it tasted sweet, that doctors in the mid-1990s were not routinely testing for it, and that men who trusted the person cooking for them tended not to ask what was in the food. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Lynn Turner poisoned a police officer and a firefighter 6 years apart with the same method, and was only caught because a grieving mother read an obituary and recognised the pattern. The next case is Blanche Taylor Moore, a church-going North Carolina woman who had been slipping arsenic into the food of the men around her for nearly 20 years. Case 6. Blanche Taylor Moore. The town of Burlington, North Carolina, sits in Alamance County, in the central part of the state, midway between Greensboro and Durham, the kind of Piedmont community built around textile mills and furniture plants and the Baptist churches that anchored every neighborhood. Blanche Kaiser was born there on February 17, 1933. Her father, Parker Davis Kaiser, was an ordained Baptist minister who drank heavily, gambled, and kept the company of other women throughout Blanche's childhood. Blanche later told investigators and journalists that her father had forced her into prostitution to cover his gambling debts. He was, by every account from people who knew the family, a man who presented a public face of religious devotion, while the private face was something harder and more damaging. Blanche left home as soon as she was able. She was 19 years old when she married James Napoleon Taylor in 1952. James was a Korean War veteran who restored furniture for a living. They had 2 daughters together, one in 1953 and another in 1959. They lived in Burlington. Blanche got a job at the local Kroger supermarket and worked her way up to head cashier, the highest position available to a woman at that store at that time. In 1962, a man named Raymond Carlton Reed came to work at the same Kroger. He was a divorced assistant manager. Blanche and Raymond began an affair. The affair continued, quietly and without public acknowledgement, for more than 2 decades. Raymond wanted to marry her. Blanche had reasons to delay. The 2 of them settled into a long, hidden arrangement that ran alongside Blanche's marriage to James for years. In October 1973, James Taylor died. He was 45 years old. The cause of death recorded at the time was a heart attack. He had been found unresponsive at home. Blanche did not raise particular alarm among her neighbours or her church community. She was a widow. People in Burlington knew her as a quiet, devout, charitable woman who brought food to sick neighbours and volunteered at her church and kept her house in good order. Her colleagues at the Kroger found her reliable and kind. James Taylor was buried, and his death certificate said heart attack, and the community accepted it. With James gone, Blanche and Raymond began seeing each other openly. The relationship continued through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Raymond's son Steve later described Blanche to journalists as polite and very good at manipulating to get her way. He said she presented as a sweet Christian lady. He said his father had not seen anything beneath that surface. The 2 of them were together for years without marrying, the delay attributed to a tangle of personal circumstances on Blanche's side that kept a formal commitment just out of reach. Raymond apparently accepted this. He stayed. He was her companion, her public partner, the man most people in Burlington associated with her by the early 1980s. In 1985, Blanche filed a lawsuit against Kroger alleging workplace injuries. The lawsuit required her to maintain a certain public image, and she could not be seen to be in a romantic relationship that contradicted her claims, which included assertions about emotional damage and social withdrawal. She met a man at church that same Easter Sunday. His name was Dwight Moore. He was a divorced pastor at the Carolina United Church of Christ in rural Alamance County. They began meeting for meals. They began a relationship that Blanche kept carefully concealed, both from Raymond and from the public, because of the ongoing lawsuit. She was, in the spring of 1985, conducting a hidden relationship with a new man while maintaining her long-standing arrangement with Raymond and continuing to present herself to her community as a woman of quiet Christian virtue. In 1986, Raymond Reed became ill. His initial diagnosis was shingles. He was hospitalized in April of that year. His condition did not improve in the way a shingles case normally improves. He developed fluid retention and projectile vomiting and multi-organ stress. He was moved between facilities. Doctors at North Carolina Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem, where he was treated during part of his illness, ordered a toxicology screen. The results came back. They showed arsenic. The results were recorded in his medical file. Raymond Reed died on October 7, 1986. His official cause of death was recorded as Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological condition whose symptoms can overlap with arsenic poisoning in ways that were, particularly in the mid-1980s, possible to confuse. The toxicology finding was in his file. Nobody acted on it. The file sat. Blanche and Dwight Moore began seeing each other publicly after Raymond's death. Dwight's family and congregation knew about the relationship. Blanche's Kroger lawsuit was eventually settled in 1987. She was also diagnosed with breast cancer that year and underwent treatment. Dwight proposed. The two of them planned a wedding. On April 19, 1989, they married. 5 days after the wedding, Dwight Moore became severely ill. He was admitted to Alamance County Hospital on April 28. His symptoms were extreme nausea and vomiting and progressive neurological deterioration. He was transferred between facilities, eventually landing at North Carolina Memorial Hospital in Chapel Hill, where doctors were baffled. Dwight told them he had been working with herbicide around the property recently. That explanation was explored and did not hold. His condition worsened. He was near death. The doctors at Chapel Hill, working with the hospital toxicologist, ordered a comprehensive toxicology panel. The results came back on a date in May 1989. Dwight Moore had arsenic in his system at 20 times the lethal dose, the highest concentration of arsenic ever recorded in a living patient at that hospital by the account of the physicians who treated him. He had a constitution robust enough to survive it, but the damage was permanent. He lost the full use of his hands and feet. He would never fully recover. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation was notified. When detectives interviewed Dwight from his hospital bed, he mentioned, in passing, that a former boyfriend of Blanche's had died some years earlier from what had been diagnosed as Guillain-Barré syndrome. The detectives recognized the overlap immediately. Investigators also discovered that Blanche had been attempting to have Dwight's pension benefits changed to name her as the primary beneficiary while he was in the hospital. The picture that was forming was not ambiguous. Exhumations were ordered. The bodies of Raymond Reed, James Napoleon Taylor, and Blanche's father Parker Kaiser were exhumed. The results confirmed what the investigators had already begun to suspect. Raymond Reed's body showed arsenic at levels determined to be fatal, reclassifying his death as arsenic poisoning rather than Guillain-Barré syndrome. The toxicology finding that had been sitting in his Baptist hospital file since 1986 was now the central piece of evidence in a murder investigation. James Taylor's body showed arsenic at levels consistent with fatal poisoning, reclassifying his 1973 heart attack. Parker Kaiser's body showed elevated arsenic levels as well, though the concentration was determined to be below a directly fatal threshold, and no charges were ultimately filed in his case. A woman named Isla Taylor, James's mother and Blanche's former mother-in-law, had also been exhumed. Her body showed elevated arsenic. Investigators pulled the pharmacy poison registers the same approach that had unravelled Amy Archer Gilligan's operation in Windsor 7 decades earlier. The registers showed Blanche's name. They showed repeated arsenic purchases. The arsenic she had been buying was a commercial ant killer called Anti-Ant, an arsenic-based product available in hardware stores. She had asked Dwight to procure some of it for her while they were dating, in 1985, before Raymond became ill. The purchase records and Dwight's account placed the arsenic in her hands at the relevant times. Blanche Taylor Moore was arrested on July 18, 1989. She was 56 years old. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Raymond Reed and James Taylor, and with assault with a deadly weapon in the near-fatal poisoning of Dwight Moore. She was held without bond. She denied everything. She told investigators that both Raymond and James had likely been taking arsenic themselves, that both men had been depressed, that the most probable explanation for the arsenic in their bodies was self-administration. Investigators found this highly improbable, as they noted in their reports, given that self-administration of arsenic, in the specific chronic pattern suggested by the autopsy findings, involving repeated small doses over extended periods, was not consistent with suicidal intent and was not supported by any evidence from either man's life or from anyone who had known them. Before the trial began, Blanche's defense attorney presented the court with a handwritten letter. The letter was addressed to Blanche and was signed by a man named Garvin Thomas. In it, Thomas confessed to having poisoned the men in Blanche's life because he was in love with her and could not bear to see her with others. The letter was dramatic and detailed and completely fabricated. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation obtained multiple samples of Blanche's handwriting and subjected the letter to forensic analysis. The handwriting experts concluded that Blanche had written the letter herself. The defense's expert said he could not determine who had written it. The prosecution's expert said it was Blanche. The jury would later hear both opinions and decide which account the evidence supported. The trial opened at Forsyth Superior Court in Winston-Salem on October 21, 1990. The prosecution was handled by District Attorney Warren Sparrow, who told reporters before the proceedings began that a pretty face could hide an evil mind. The state called 54 witnesses. The medical testimony established the pattern of arsenic administration, multiple small doses over extended periods, in all 3 confirmed cases, consistent with chronic poisoning through food or drink rather than a single acute exposure. Several witnesses testified that Blanche had continued to bring food to Raymond Reed while he was hospitalized. Blanche had told investigators she had never given Raymond food in the hospital. The witnesses contradicted that directly. Blanche took the stand in her own defense. She was composed. She was tearful at times. She described herself as a very giving person who had tried to be there for others. She denied that she had ever poisoned anyone. She denied that she had access to sufficient arsenic. She denied that she had any reason to harm Raymond, who had been her companion for 20 years. She held her position under cross-examination for 2 days. Dwight Moore, still recovering from the damage the arsenic had done to his nervous system, was present in the courtroom. He had defended Blanche publicly in the early days of the investigation, refusing to believe what authorities were telling him until the evidence was laid out in front of him directly. He had filed for divorce. He sat in the courtroom and listened to his wife deny that she had poisoned him with 20 times the lethal dose of arsenic 5 days after their wedding. On November 14, 1990, the jury convicted Blanche Taylor Moore of first-degree murder in the death of Raymond Reed. The deliberations lasted a matter of hours. 3 days later, the jury returned to consider sentencing. Under North Carolina law at the time, the jury had the authority to recommend death or life imprisonment. They recommended death. Judge Thomas C. formally sentenced Blanche Taylor Moore to death on January 18, 1991. She was 57 years old. Prosecutors subsequently dropped the charges related to James Taylor's death and the assault charges connected to Dwight's poisoning, having secured the outcome they needed in Raymond Reed's case. Blanche Taylor Moore has been on North Carolina's death row for more than 30 years. She has maintained her innocence throughout. She has filed multiple appeals. None have succeeded. North Carolina carried out its last execution in 2006 and has been under a de facto moratorium since then, connected to ongoing litigation about execution protocols. Blanche Moore has outlived that moratorium by nearly 2 decades. She is the oldest person currently on death row in North Carolina. As of 2022, she was 89 years old and still incarcerated at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh. The actuarial reality of her situation is that she will almost certainly die in that facility before the state resolves its execution moratorium. Dwight Moore eventually recovered to the degree his permanent nerve damage allowed. He moved to Virginia. He remarried. He died in 2013 from natural causes, having survived the 20 times the lethal arsenic dose administered by his wife during what was, by the calendar, the first week of their marriage. His family described the years after the trial as a long, slow process of rebuilding a life around a fact that resisted being fully absorbed. Raymond Reed's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against North Carolina Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem, the facility where a toxicology screen had found arsenic in Raymond's system in 1986, and where that finding had been recorded in his chart and not acted upon. The lawsuit alleged that the hospital's failure to report the finding or investigate further had allowed Raymond's poisoning to continue until his death. The lawsuit was settled. The terms were not made public. James Taylor's daughters grew up knowing their father had died in 1973 of what they were told was a heart attack. They were adults with lives of their own when investigators told them that the arsenic in his exhumed body indicated he had been murdered by the woman who had been their mother. That fact arrived in their lives in 1989, 16 years after James had died. What they did with it afterward is not part of the public record. The banana pudding is a detail that appears in several of the news accounts of the case, and in the television documentary coverage sourced from people who knew Blanche in Burlington. She was known for her banana pudding. It was her signature dish. She brought it to church events and neighbourhood gatherings, and to the bedsides of sick friends and colleagues. And the people who received it remembered it as the kind of food that made you feel cared for. The specific mechanics of how arsenic was incorporated into the food she prepared for the men she was poisoning were not established in court testimony with the granularity of a recipe. What was established was that she prepared food for them, that she administered the arsenic over extended periods, and that the doses were consistent with something mixed into consumed food or drink. The banana pudding appears in the coverage not as evidence but as context. It is the domestic detail that keeps returning in the accounts of people who knew her, because it captures the specific nature of what made her capable of doing what she did for as long as she did it. She was the person whose cooking you looked forward to. She was the person you trusted with the food on your plate. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Blanche Taylor Moore poisoned a boyfriend, a husband, and nearly killed a pastor she married 5 days before he was hospitalized, and she has been on death row for over 30 years without being executed. The next case is Lacey Spears, a young mother who documented her son's mysterious illnesses across thousands of social media posts while she was the one making him sick. Case 7. Lacey Spears Garnett Paul Spears was born on December 3, 2008 in Alabama. He was a blonde, blue-eyed boy who spent most of his short life in and out of hospitals and doctors' offices, attached to feeding tubes and medical equipment, surrounded by the particular anxiety of a child who seems perpetually unwell in ways that no one can quite explain. He died on January 23, 2014, in a hospital in Valhalla, New York. He was 5 years old. The cause of death was hyponatremia, a condition produced by dangerously elevated sodium levels in the blood, which causes the brain to swell. The sodium had been put there deliberately, through his feeding tube, by his mother. Lacey Spears was born in Kentucky and grew up in Alabama. She was 25 years old when Garnett died. She had, from the earliest weeks of his life, documented his medical condition obsessively across multiple social media platforms. She maintained a blog. She posted on Facebook, Twitter, and MySpace. She uploaded thousands of entries across several years, each one cataloguing Garnett's latest symptoms, his most recent hospitalization, his newest diagnosis, the equipment he required, the procedures he had undergone. The posts were written in the voice of a devoted and exhausted mother, navigating a medical mystery that no doctor seemed able to solve. She had a following of people who expressed sympathy and encouragement. She had built, in the language of the early social media era, a community around her son's illness. The illness was real. The cause of it was her. The condition Lacey Spears was eventually diagnosed with after Garnett's death is known in clinical literature as factitious disorder imposed on another, sometimes referenced by its older name, Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The disorder involves a caregiver, most commonly a mother, who fabricates or induces illness in a person under their care, typically a child, in order to assume a sick role by proxy and receive the attention and sympathy that accompanies caring for a gravely ill dependent. The judge who sentenced Lacey Spears acknowledged the diagnosis formally and referenced it in his sentencing remarks. The disorder is real and documented and was part of the clinical and legal record of the case. It does not alter what was done to Garnett. It provides a framework for understanding the motivation. Garnett received sodium through his feeding tube across years of his life in doses that caused repeated hospitalizations and permanent physiological stress. And the person who administered it was the person who then drove him to the hospital and sat by his bed and posted updates to her followers about how frightening it all was. Garnett had a gastrostomy tube, a feeding tube inserted through the abdomen directly into the stomach, from infancy. The tube had been placed in response to documented feeding difficulties early in his life. Once it was in place, it gave Lacey direct and private access to what entered his body, bypassing the normal oral route that other people could observe. She used it. The sodium she administered caused his blood sodium levels to rise periodically to dangerous thresholds, producing symptoms including seizure-like episodes and neurological distress that sent Garnett to emergency departments repeatedly. Each hospitalization was genuine in the sense that Garnett was genuinely ill each time. Each hospitalization was caused in the sense that his mother had put sodium into his tube before bringing him in. In the months before Garnett's death, Lacey had moved with him from Alabama to Florida and eventually to Chestnut Ridge, New York, a small community in Rockland County. They lived in a residential fellowship community called The Fellowship, which housed elderly and disabled residents alongside others in need of support. Lacey had told people in the community that Garnett had multiple serious medical conditions. She had constructed a background story for Garnett that included a fictional father, a police officer named Blake, who had died in a car accident. She had told Garnett's biological father, a man named Chris Hill, that Garnett was not his son and had warned him to keep his distance. She had, across the years of Garnett's life, created a self-contained narrative in which she and Garnett existed together in a medical emergency that only she was equipped to manage. On January 9, 2014, Garnett was admitted to Nyack Hospital in Rockland County. Lacey told doctors he had been having seizure-like symptoms. His sodium level on admission was 138 milliequivalents per litre, within a normal range. Hospital staff set up video monitoring equipment in his room, including a camera recording his movements and his mother's. The footage captured what followed. Over the next several days, Garnett's condition fluctuated. The hospital records showed that on 2 occasions, Lacey took Garnett into the bathroom of his hospital room. Shortly after each bathroom visit, Garnett's condition deteriorated significantly. His sodium level began to rise without any medical explanation. On January 19th, 5 days after the second bathroom visit, his sodium level was recorded at 182 milliequivalents per litre. A level of 182 is catastrophic. At that concentration, sodium draws water out of brain cells, causing them to shrink and the brain to pull away from the skull, producing swelling, hemorrhage, and progressive neurological collapse. Garnett was transferred by medical helicopter to Maria Ferrari Children's Hospital at Westchester Medical Center in Valhalla on January 19th. His brain was swelling. Westchester County detectives were notified and began working with hospital staff. On January 21st, Garnett was declared brain dead. He was taken off life support on January 23, 2014. He was 5 years old and 1 month. Investigators executed search warrants on Lacey's apartment in Chestnut Ridge. During the initial search and a second search conducted approximately 48 hours later, they recovered 2 feeding bags. The bags were the kind used with Garnett's gastrostomy tube. Laboratory analysis of the bags found massive concentrations of sodium inside them. Each bag contained the equivalent of at least 69 individual packets of table salt. The detective leading the investigation, Dan Carfey of the Westchester County Department of Public Safety, stated that the amounts of sodium in those bags were lethal. Lacey told investigators the bags had passed through multiple hands between the time they were removed from her home and the time police collected them, and that she had not placed sodium in them. She said she had never poisoned her son with salt. 10 weeks after Garnett's death, the Westchester County Medical Examiner ruled his death a homicide. The cause was recorded as acute salt poisoning. The manner was recorded as homicide. Lacey Spears was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. Westchester County District Attorney Janet DeFiore stated at the time of the arrest that throughout his short life, Garnett had been forced to suffer through repeated hospitalizations, unneeded surgical procedures, and ultimately poisoning with salt, all at the hands of the one person who should have been his ultimate protector. The trial opened in Westchester County Court in White Plains in February 2015. Assistant District Attorney Doreen Lloyd presented the prosecution's case. Lloyd told the jury in her opening statement that Lacey Spears was a calculating child killer who had researched, planned, carried out, and attempted to cover up the killing of her son. The prosecution presented the hospital surveillance footage showing Lacey and Garnett entering the bathroom twice and the subsequent deterioration of his condition each time. They presented the sodium levels tracking upward while he was in hospital under observation, with no medical explanation other than external administration. They presented the feeding bags and the laboratory analysis. They presented years of social media posts documenting Lacey's construction of Garnett's illness narrative. They presented records of Lacey's online research into the dangers of elevated sodium levels in children, conducted in the period before his final hospitalization. The defense, led by attorneys Stephen Riebling and David Sachs, argued there was no direct evidence that Lacey had administered sodium. Riebling told the jury at the start of proceedings to listen to the silence, which he said represented the sum total of the direct evidence against his client. No eyewitness, no forensic evidence from the scene of the alleged crime, no explanation for why she would have done it. The defense also suggested that the hospital itself bore responsibility, arguing that changes to Garnett's diet during his admission and a rapid IV saline infusion given on one occasion could have contributed to his sodium levels. The prosecution's medical experts rebutted this directly. The defense additionally challenged the handling of the feeding bags, noting the 48-hour gap between their removal from the apartment and their collection by police. The jury convicted Lacey Spears of second-degree murder on March 2, 2015. The deliberations lasted approximately 2 days. Judge Robert Neary sentenced her on April 8, 2015. He acknowledged the factitious disorder imposed on another diagnosis and said it was a factor in the sentence he imposed, which was 20 years to life rather than the maximum 25 years to life. He told the courtroom that Garnett had spent his entire short life suffering at the hands of the person charged with his care. Lacey Spears sat at the defense table and showed no visible reaction as the sentence was pronounced. Her legal team indicated they would appeal. The appeal was pursued through the New York State court system. The appellate division upheld the conviction. The New York Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, declined to review it. The conviction stands. Lacey Spears maintains her innocence. She has given interviews from custody in which she described losing Garnett as the greatest loss she will ever suffer. She has said she misses being able to pick him up and hug him. She has said she did not poison him. The feeding bags containing 69 salt packets each, the sodium level of 182 recorded in a child admitted with a level of 138, the bathroom visits captured on hospital surveillance, the years of documented social media construction of his illness, the online research into sodium toxicity in children, all of it remains in the case record. Garnett Spears is buried in Alabama. He had lived in Alabama, Florida, and New York. He had spent a substantial portion of his 5 years in hospitals. His biological father, Chris Hill, who had been told the child was not his, learned after Garnett's death that Garnett had in fact been his son. What that information cost him is not part of the public record. The social media archive Lacey maintained across the years of Garnett's life, thousands of posts documenting his symptoms and hospitalizations and medical appointments, remains in the public record of the case. Prosecutors used it as evidence. It is a detailed chronological account of a mother watching her child suffer, written entirely from the perspective of someone who did not know why he kept getting sick. The person who wrote it knew exactly why. She had been documenting, in real time and with apparent sincerity, the effects of what she was doing to him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Lacey Spears administered salt to her son through a feeding tube for years and documented his deterioration on social media while it was happening. The next case moves to North Carolina, where a chemist named Ann Miller Kontz was having an affair with a colleague at GlaxoSmithKline and had decided that arsenic was a cleaner solution than telling her husband the truth. Case 8. Ann Miller Kontz. Eric Miller was 30 years old when he died on December 2, 2000, in a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was a pediatric AIDS researcher at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, working on a federal grant, doing the kind of science that paid modestly and mattered considerably. He had met his wife Anne at Purdue University, where both had been undergraduate students. They had moved to North Carolina together after graduation to pursue graduate degrees at North Carolina State University. Eric completed his doctorate in 1998. Anne abandoned her doctoral studies partway through and took a position as a research scientist at GlaxoSmithKline, the British pharmaceutical company with a major research facility in the Research Triangle area. The job paid well. Eric's research fellowship did not. Anne liked nice things. She liked a nicer house, nicer cars, a boat, the material markers of a life that Eric's salary as a research fellow could not fully support. The tension between what Anne wanted and what their household could afford had been present in the marriage for years before the arsenic appeared. Ann Miller was 30 years old in 2000. She was, by every account from colleagues and investigators who later described her, an attractive and capable woman who understood how to present herself. She had, by the account of the lead detective on the case, Lieutenant Chris Morgan of the Raleigh Police Department, been conducting affairs for years before the marriage ended. One affair involved a man in California. She had financed cross-country flights and hotel stays in New York and at the Outer Banks, paying for the logistics of a relationship her husband did not know existed. By the autumn of 2000, the most significant affair was with a colleague at GlaxoSmithKline named Daryl Willard. Willard was a research scientist. He and Anne had access through their work to a range of chemical compounds that the general public could not obtain. Among those compounds was arsenic. The specific form they had access to was used in laboratory processes. It was not the kind of arsenic available at a hardware store. It was research-grade material, and it sat in the GlaxoSmithKline laboratories where both of them worked. Eric Miller had been planning to move out. The marriage had deteriorated to a point where a separation was the agreed direction. The specifics of how the household would divide were not yet settled, but the trajectory was clear. Anne did not want a divorce, by the account of the detective who spent 5 years working the case. Not because she wanted to stay married to Eric in any meaningful sense, but because divorce, in Anne's construction of herself, represented a failure she was unwilling to absorb publicly. Lieutenant Morgan explained it in an interview years later, with a precision that has stayed in the public record of the case. She could not divorce him, he said, because in Anne's world, that amounted to admitting she was not perfect. In late November 2000, Eric went bowling with Anne, Daryl Willard, and 2 other colleagues. During the outing, Eric drank a beer and complained within an hour that it tasted bitter. He began to feel unwell. In the days that followed, his condition worsened progressively. He developed nausea, vomiting, and neurological symptoms that his doctors could not immediately explain. He was hospitalized. The treating physicians at the hospital in Raleigh ran standard tests. The results did not produce a clear diagnosis. His condition continued to deteriorate. He was moved to intensive care. His organs were failing. The medical team could not identify a cause that accounted for the full presentation. On December 2, 2000, Eric Miller's heart stopped. He was 30 years old. He had been a healthy man before the bowling trip. The death was treated initially as a medical mystery rather than a criminal matter. The Raleigh Police Department opened a preliminary inquiry, but did not immediately have grounds to pursue it as a homicide. Anne had already moved on within months. She left Raleigh, taking her and Eric's young daughter Claire with her, and relocated 2 hours south to Wilmington to live near her sister. She had a new man in her life, a Christian rock musician named Paul Kontz. She had a new job working for an interior designer. She had, in Detective Morgan's words, completely reinvented her life in the space of about 6 months. An innocent person, he believed, would have been hounding the police for answers. Anne was not hounding anyone for anything. The investigation moved slowly because the evidence moved slowly. Arsenic poisoning, in its acute form, administered in concentrated doses over a short period, rather than in the chronic small dose pattern used by Blanche Taylor Moore, produces a presentation that can resemble a number of other acute medical conditions. Without a specific order to test for heavy metals, the standard toxicology panel does not capture it. Eric's autopsy had not initially included targeted arsenic testing. Investigators eventually obtained samples and had them tested. The results confirmed arsenic poisoning as the cause of death. The medical examiner amended the cause of death accordingly. The investigation centred on 2 people with access to research-grade arsenic and a motive to want Eric gone: Ann Miller and Darrell Willard. Investigators interviewed Willard. He denied involvement and ended the interview. He consulted an attorney named Rick Gammon. In January 2001, approximately 6 weeks after Eric's death, Forsyth County detectives contacted Willard again in connection with the investigation. The pressure of the questioning was significant. On the day after his second interview with investigators, Willard's wife Yvonne came home from work and found her husband dead in their garage. He had shot himself. He left a suicide note that said he had been accused of an action for which he was not responsible and that he had taken no one's life save his own. Willard was dead. Anne was in Wilmington. The direct line between the arsenic and the person who had administered it had just closed itself. Investigators had their strong suspicions and their circumstantial evidence, but circumstantial evidence in a case where the most important witness had just died by suicide presented serious legal difficulties. Detective Morgan spent the next several years working the case from every available angle. Anne had married Paul Kontz by then. She was living in Wilmington under a new name. Morgan tracked her anyway. He watched the case from a distance, waiting for something to break. What broke it was an attorney and a court order. Before Darrell Willard died, he had consulted Rick Gammon about the investigation. Attorney-client privilege protected whatever Willard had told Gammon from disclosure. The Raleigh Police Department and prosecutors believed that Willard's communication with Gammon contained information directly relevant to a murder. They sought to compel Gammon to reveal it. Gammon refused, citing privilege. The dispute went to the North Carolina Supreme Court, which took 2 years to resolve. In May 2004, the court ruled that Gammon must disclose what Willard had told him. Gammon's notes were turned over. They contained an account of a meeting between Willard and Ann Miller that had taken place while Eric was still hospitalized and fighting for his life. According to Gammon's notes, Willard told him that Ann had met him in a parking lot. She had been crying. She had told him that while Eric was in the hospital, she had been alone in his room. She had taken a syringe from her purse. The syringe contained a substance. She had injected the contents of the syringe into Eric's IV line. Willard had asked her why she had done it. She had said she did not know why she had done it. That statement, transmitted from a dead man through his attorney's notes to a court, and then to investigators 4 years after Eric died, was enough. Ann Miller Kontz was indicted for murder in 2004 and arrested. She was held without bond. The case the prosecution had assembled by the time it was ready for trial included the arsenic in Eric's body, the access both Ann and Willard had to arsenic at GlaxoSmithKline, the bitter taste of the beer at the bowling outing, consistent with arsenic having been added, Ann's affair with Willard and her simultaneous affairs with other men, her rapid departure from Raleigh after Eric's death, her financial motivations, and now the account from Gammon's notes, placing a syringe in her hand at Eric's bedside. There were also phone records and email records from the period, showing the communication between Anne and Willard in the months before and after Eric's death. The prosecution acknowledged, as District Attorney Willoughby put it, that there were legal frailties in the case that made a trial outcome uncertain and a conviction on appeal potentially vulnerable. A plea agreement was negotiated. On November 8, 2005, Anne Miller Contz appeared in court in Raleigh and entered guilty pleas to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. She was 35 years old. She acknowledged in court, when the judge asked her directly, that she had, with malice, unlawfully and intentionally participated in causing the death of Eric Miller. The courtroom contained Eric's family. His parents, Verus and Doris Miller, were present. His sisters Pam and Leanne were present. They had waited 5 years for this moment. Leanne addressed Anne directly during the victim impact portion of the proceedings. She asked Anne why she could not look at her. She asked why Anne had not simply divorced Eric if she wanted to leave. She said she did not believe Anne truly loved their daughter Claire, because a woman who loved her daughter would not have taken away the girl's father. She said she would never understand it. Pam Miller told reporters after the hearing that she thought pure evil existed in the world and that Anne fell into that category. Detective Morgan, who was approaching retirement and who colleagues said had been so consumed by the case that it had defined the final years of his career, said that in 5 years of following the investigation, there was no doubt in his mind who the lead in the situation had been. He said that was Anne Miller. Judge Donald Stevens sentenced Anne Miller Contz to 25 to 31.5 years in prison. Her attorney read a statement on her behalf that said she felt a deep sense of remorse and regret, and that she would struggle for the rest of her life with how it could have happened. Anne did not speak directly. She kept her head down and cried quietly while Eric's family spoke. His family described her silence with contempt. The custody of Claire, the daughter Eric and Anne had together, was resolved through a separate agreement. Eric's family sought to ensure that Anne would not be able to raise Claire from prison. Verus Miller said at the sentencing that one of the reasons the plea agreement was so good was that it removed Anne from Claire's life. Claire went to live with Anne's sister in Wilmington. The Millers continued to express concern about the arrangement in interviews in the years after the sentencing. Anne Miller Contz has been serving her sentence at a North Carolina women's correctional facility. She will be eligible for parole consideration within the range of her sentence. Detective Morgan retired from the Raleigh Police Department. He said in interviews conducted after the case concluded that the thing that had driven him was the image of Eric Miller, a man who had given up a high-paying pharmaceutical industry job to do pediatric AIDS research on a federal grant, dying in a hospital in Raleigh because his wife did not want the social embarrassment of a divorce. That was the bottom of it, Morgan said. She did not want people to think the marriage had failed. Eric Miller is buried in North Carolina. His pediatric AIDS research, the work he had chosen over the industry salary, was left unfinished. The grant he had been working under was eventually absorbed by other researchers. The laboratory where he had been working continued without him. Daryl Willard is buried in North Carolina. His wife, Yvonne, who had come home from work to find her husband dead in their garage, gave testimony during the legal proceedings and spoke publicly about her belief that Anne had manipulated Willard and that he had not been capable of the crime she was attempting to attribute to him in her plea. Yvonne Willard said Anne had been playing the system. She said the attempt in the plea to share blame with a dead man was something she found unconscionable. The syringe that Anne took from her purse in Eric's hospital room, the one she told Daryl Willard about in a parking lot while Eric was still alive and fighting for his life, was never recovered as physical evidence. It had been disposed of long before anyone knew to look for it. What remained was a dead man's account, passed through a dead man's attorney, compelled by a state Supreme Court ruling, arriving 4 years late into a criminal case that had been waiting for exactly that piece to move forward. It was, by the account of everyone who worked the case, barely enough. It was enough. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Anne Miller Contz poisoned her husband at his hospital bedside with a syringe from her own purse, and the case sat unsolved for 4 years until a court order forced a dead man's lawyer to talk. The next case is Tianlei Li, a pharmaceutical chemist who ordered thallium through her employer and slipped it into her husband's food because she did not want to sign the divorce papers. Case 9. Tianle Li. On January 14, 2011, Xiaoye Wang checked himself into the University Medical Center at Princeton in New Jersey. He was 39 years old. He was a computer software engineer. He had been feeling unwell for several weeks, experiencing symptoms that had begun in November 2010 and had been escalating slowly ever since. Nausea, abdominal pain, a progressive weakness in his limbs that he could not explain, a tingling and burning sensation in his feet that one clinical description later compared to the feeling of walking on hot coals. His hair had begun to fall out. He had gone to doctors in the weeks before the hospitalization and had not received a diagnosis that accounted for the full picture. On January 14th, he went to the Princeton Medical Center because the symptoms had become severe enough that he could no longer manage them at home. January 14th, 2011 was also the date on which his divorce from his wife, Tianle Li, was scheduled to be finalized. Tianle Li was 43 years old in 2011. She had been born in Beijing and had come to the United States in the late 1990s to study. She had met Xiaoye Wang when both were graduate students at the University of Pennsylvania. They had married and settled in Monroe, a township in Middlesex County in central New Jersey. They had a son together who was, at the time of Xiaoye's death, approximately 2 years old. Tianle had worked for 10 years as a chemist at Bristol Myers Squibb, the biopharmaceutical company with research operations in central New Jersey. She was, by professional measure, accomplished. She had a decade of pharmaceutical chemistry behind her. She understood compounds and their properties and their effects on the human body at a level of technical precision that most people never approach. The marriage had been deteriorating for some time before 2010. There had been domestic disputes serious enough that police had been called to the Monroe residence on multiple occasions. The accounts of what drove the deterioration vary between the two families. Tianle's defense at trial suggested that some of the conflict arose from cultural friction between her and Xiaoye's family, who had come from China to help the couple care for their young son, and whose more traditional expectations clashed with what the defense described as Tianle's more Americanized way of life. The prosecution did not dispute that the marriage had been difficult. It focused on what Tianle had done in response to the difficulty. By November 2010, divorce proceedings were underway. The terms were being negotiated. The arguments concerned custody of their son, the family home, and financial arrangements. Tianle did not want the divorce. The prosecution's position, stated clearly in opening arguments by Middlesex County Deputy First Assistant Prosecutor Christy Bavacqua, was that rather than allow her husband to divorce her, Tianle Li chose murder. The specific timing of what she did supports that framing. The thallium she ordered through her Bristol Myers Squibb laboratory account was requisitioned in November 2010, the same month the divorce proceedings were formalized and the settlement terms were being worked out. The divorce was due to be finalized on January 14, 2011. Xiaoye Wang was admitted to hospital on January 14, 2011, with symptoms consistent with thallium poisoning that had been progressing for approximately 2 months. Thallium is not a compound that most people have encountered. It is a heavy metal, odorless, colorless, and tasteless in its soluble salt forms. It has been called the poisoner's poison because its properties make it nearly ideal for undetected administration. It dissolves in liquid without producing any detectable taste or smell. A fatal dose is extraordinarily small. During the trial, a prosecutor asked an FBI toxicologist to illustrate the lethal quantity by comparison to something familiar. The toxicologist was handed a single pink packet of artificial sweetener. She told the jury that less than the amount she was holding in her hand was sufficient to kill a person. Thallium is so toxic because the body's cells mistake it for potassium, an essential mineral, and absorb it through the same pathways. Once inside cells, it disrupts a cascade of biological processes, causing progressive nerve damage, organ failure, and, at sufficient doses, death. The symptoms it produces in the weeks before death, the burning neuropathy, the hair loss, the gastrointestinal distress, the ascending weakness, mimic a range of other conditions closely enough that without specific testing, it is routinely missed. In the United States, Thallium has been banned from consumer use since 1975. It is not available to the public. It is used in certain specialized laboratory applications, including some chemical reactions in pharmaceutical research. Tianlei Li had access to it through her employer. The prosecution presented evidence at trial showing that Tianlei had ordered 4 bottles of a thallium salt compound from Bristol Myers Squibb's internal chemical inventory system in November 2010. She had used her professional credentials and her laboratory account to make the requisition. 3 of the 4 bottles were subsequently returned to storage. Records showed that the returned bottles contained less of the compound than they had when she received them. Her own laboratory records showed she had not used thallium in any of the chemical reactions she performed at work during the relevant period. The thallium that had left those bottles had gone somewhere. It had not gone into her research. The prosecution's argument was straightforward. She had taken it home and put it in her husband's food. The doctors at the Princeton Medical Center who received Xiaoye Wang on January 14th could not immediately determine what was wrong with him. His presentation was unusual. His symptoms pointed toward a neurological condition, but no standard diagnosis fit cleanly. A nurse on the ward had encountered, in her training, a description of thallium poisoning. The symptoms she was observing in Xiaoye matched what she remembered. She raised the possibility with the treating physicians. A urine sample was sent to a specialized laboratory out of state because no facilities in New Jersey at that time were equipped to run a thallium screen. Stephen Marcus, the executive director of New Jersey Poison Control, received a call from Princeton Medical Center on the morning of January 25th. He later said that what the doctor told him nearly knocked him flat. It was only the second case of thallium poisoning he had encountered in 43 years in the field. The urine results confirmed it. Xiaoye Wang had been poisoned with thallium. The level in his system was far beyond what could produce the symptoms he was experiencing. It was, by the clinical assessments entered into evidence, far beyond a survivable threshold given the duration of exposure. Xiaoye Wang died at the hospital on January 15, 2011, 1 day after admitting himself. He had been poisoned over a period of approximately 2 months. The Prussian blue antidote that can treat thallium poisoning, by binding to the thallium in the gut and preventing its reabsorption, could not be sourced and delivered to the hospital in time to save him. He was 39 years old. His son was 2 years old. The divorce he had been trying to finalize was never finalized. He died still legally married to the woman who had poisoned him. Investigators moved quickly once the thallium finding was confirmed. They identified Tianlei as the person with access to thallium and with a motive. They obtained her laboratory records from Bristol Myers Squibb. They found the requisition orders. They found the discrepancy between the amount returned and the amount received. They found, in Tianlei's laptop case, printed articles about thallium and its effects on humans. She had been researching the compound, its toxicity, its detection thresholds, its symptoms. She had the research in physical form in her possession. Investigators also discovered that Tianlei had booked one-way flights to China for herself and her son. She had not booked a return. The booking had been made in the period after Xiaoye was hospitalized. The inference was that she had been preparing to leave the country permanently before the investigation closed around her. Tianlei Li was arrested on February 10, 2011, approximately 3 weeks after Xiaoye's death. She was charged with first-degree murder. She was held in the Middlesex County Jail pending trial. She denied the charges from the moment of her arrest and continued to deny them throughout the legal proceedings. In the jail, she spoke to another inmate. The inmate later testified at trial that Tianlei had told her, in the course of conversations in the facility, that she had poisoned her husband with the thallium she had obtained from work. The jailhouse confession, as it is described in the case record, was one of the prosecution's most significant pieces of evidence, alongside the laboratory records and the laptop articles. Tianlei's defense challenged the credibility of the inmate witness. The jury heard the challenge and accepted the testimony. The trial opened in Middlesex County in New Brunswick in June 2013. It lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution called witnesses who established the timeline of the poisoning, the laboratory records showing the thallium requisition, the discrepancy in the returned bottles, Tianlei's research into thallium toxicity, her attempt to book one-way flights to China, and the jailhouse account of her admission to a fellow inmate. They called the FBI toxicologist who illustrated the lethal dose with the sweetener packet. They called the nurse whose clinical memory had led to the correct diagnosis. They called the poison control director who described the rarity of the case. They called members of Xiaoye's family who described his progressive deterioration in the weeks before his hospitalization and the absence of any explanation for it until the thallium was confirmed. Bivakwa told the jury in her closing argument that Tianlei Li had deliberately chosen a rare poison that doctors would not test for, that she had used her professional expertise to select a compound that mimicked other conditions, that she had administered it over weeks in amounts calculated to produce a slow and undiagnosed decline, and that she had begun planning her escape before the diagnosis was confirmed. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the jailhouse witness was unreliable, and that Tianlei's access to thallium at work did not prove she had used it on her husband. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on July 9, 2013, first-degree murder, hindering her own prosecution by attempting to flee the country. Judge Michael Toto sentenced Tianlei Li on September 30, 2013. He told the courtroom that the murder had been planned, calculated, and committed in a cool and depraved manner. He sentenced her to life in prison. He additionally ordered that she would not be eligible for parole until she had served 85% of the term, which under New Jersey law amounted to a minimum of 62 years and 6 months before any parole consideration. Tianlei Li was 43 years old at sentencing. She will not be eligible for parole consideration until she is approximately 105 years old. The sentence is, in practical terms, the remainder of her natural life. Tianlei denied killing her husband at sentencing. Her attorney read a brief statement in which she said she prayed for Xiaoye's soul and intended to appeal the conviction. She cried as the statement was read. She did not address Xiaoye's family directly. Xiaoye's family was present in the courtroom. They had travelled from China. They had watched the 6-week trial. They had waited nearly 3 years from his death to the sentencing. They did not make public statements in the immediate aftermath of sentencing, beyond what was recorded in the court proceedings. The appeal was filed and pursued through the New Jersey appellate system. In April 2021, the Superior Court of New Jersey Appellate Division affirmed the conviction in full. The court reviewed the evidentiary record, the jailhouse testimony, the laboratory records, the laptop articles, the flight bookings, and the circumstantial pattern assembled by the prosecution, and found no grounds to overturn the verdict. Tianlei Li remains in a New Jersey State Correctional Facility. She continues to deny the killing. Their son, who was 2 years old when his father died, was placed in the care of relatives. The specific arrangements are not fully detailed in the public record. He was, by 2026, approximately 17 years old, having grown up without his father and with his mother in prison for his father's murder. What he has been told, and when, and by whom, sits outside what the case record contains. The specific cruelty of what Tianlei Li chose is located in the timeline. Thallium poisoning in the doses she administered did not kill quickly. It killed across weeks. The burning neuropathy that is one of its characteristic symptoms, described in clinical literature as a sensation of walking on hot coals, began in Xiaoye's extremities and progressed. The hair loss began. The abdominal pain worsened. He went to doctors who could not tell him what was wrong. He went to the emergency room. He was sent home. He came back. He checked himself in on the day his divorce was supposed to be finalised, having lived with the symptoms for 2 months without understanding their origin, and he died the following day. He had been a computer software engineer in central New Jersey. He had been trying to end a marriage through legal means. He had a 2-year-old son. The woman who had been administering the poison had been watching his symptoms develop from the same household, had researched the compound's effects in advance, had printed the articles and kept them in her laptop case, and had booked the flights out of the country before the diagnosis confirmed what she already knew she had done. The Princeton Medical Center where Xiaoye died has been referenced in subsequent medical literature on thallium poisoning as one of the cases that illustrated the diagnostic challenges of the compound in a clinical setting. The nurse whose training memory led to the correct test is part of that literature. Without her, the cause of Xiaoye's death might have been recorded as unknown, or attributed to a neurological condition that had no satisfactory explanation. The thallium requisition records at Bristol Myers Squibb might never have been examined. The laptop articles might never have been found. The jailhouse conversation might never have been reported. The one-way flights might have been used. The case record rests, in a meaningful way, on a nurse who remembered something she had learned once about a rare poison and decided it was worth raising. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Tianli Li chose a poison so obscure that no New Jersey laboratory could test for it, and her husband died on the day their divorce was meant to be finalised. The final case is Erin Patterson in Australia, who cooked individual beef Wellingtons laced with death cap mushrooms for her estranged husband's family, while making sure her own plate contained none. Case 10. Erin Patterson. The town of Leongatha sits in South Gippsland, a rural region of Victoria, Australia, approximately 135 kilometres southeast of Melbourne. It is the kind of small Australian country town built around dairy farming and timber, and the particular social cohesion of communities where everyone knows which families have been there for generations and which ones are newer arrivals. The surrounding landscape is green and hilly, the kind of country that produces close-knit rural communities with strong church networks and a collective instinct toward neighbourliness. The Pattersons and the Wilkinsons were part of that fabric. They were known in Corumburra, a nearby town, as decent, ordinary people. Don and Gail Patterson were both 70 years old. They had been married for decades. Heather Wilkinson was Gail's sister. She was 66. Her husband, Ian Wilkinson, was 68. They were church-going people. They were grandparents. They were the kind of people their community described, in the aftermath of what happened to them, as the last people in the world anything like this should have happened to. On July 29, 2023, all four of them drove to Leongatha for lunch. Erin Patterson was 48 years old in July 2023. She had been born Erin Trudy Patterson and had married Simon Patterson, Don and Gail's son, in 2007. The couple had 2 children together. The marriage had been difficult. They had separated and reconciled multiple times across its duration, with one period of separation running from approximately 2009 to 2015. By 2015, they had reunited, but the reunion was not permanent. By the time of the lunch in July 2023, Erin and Simon were estranged again. The divorce had not been finalised, but the marriage was functionally over. Simon had declined the lunch invitation. He was not there. The relationship between Erin and her in-laws had been deteriorating in the 2 years before July 2023. Simon's brother Matthew Patterson testified at trial that Erin had missed several family events during that period and had attended others only briefly. Erin had posted messages on social media to online friends in which she criticised her estranged husband and his parents. In December 2022, she wrote to an online friend that she was sick of the situation and wanted nothing to do with the Patterson family. In approximately May 2023, she had received what she later described as a late invitation to Gail's 70th birthday celebration. She felt she had been snubbed. The relationship was cold and getting colder. In the period before the lunch, Erin had told people in her social circle that she had been diagnosed with cancer. She had told her in-laws this as well. The diagnosis was false. She had also told people she was planning to have gastric bypass surgery to address her weight. This was also not true. What was true was that she had, approximately 3 months before the lunch, driven from Leongatha to Mount Waverley, a Melbourne suburb approximately 118 kilometres away, specifically to purchase dried mushrooms from an Asian supermarket. She told investigators she had bought the mushrooms there. She told investigators she had added them to the lunch without knowing they were death caps. The prosecution did not accept this account. The jury did not either. Death cap mushrooms are Amanita phalloides. They are the most lethal fungus known to science, responsible for approximately 90% of all mushroom-related fatalities worldwide. They are saturated with compounds called amatoxins, which cause catastrophic liver failure by inhibiting an enzyme essential to cell function in the liver and kidneys. There is no antidote. Treatment is supportive, aimed at keeping the patient alive long enough for the liver to regenerate or for a transplant to be sourced and performed. The window between ingestion and the onset of symptoms is deceptively long, typically 6 to 24 hours, meaning a person who has eaten death caps can feel entirely normal for a full day before the organ destruction begins. By the time symptoms appear, the amatoxins have already done the majority of their damage. Death caps look, to the untrained eye, similar to several edible species. They have a pleasant taste when cooked. The toxicologist who testified at trial, Dimitri Gerastimoulos, described them as among the most dangerous organisms on Earth. Erin Patterson served her 4 guests individual beef Wellingtons. The dish is a preparation in which beef tenderloin is wrapped in a paste of finely chopped mushrooms and then encased in puff pastry. The recipe she used called for a single large portion to be prepared and served family style. She made individual portions instead. The prosecution argued that she reverted to individual servings specifically so she could control which portions contained the death caps and which did not. Erin told the court she had been unable to find the correct ingredients to make the recipe as directed and had adapted accordingly. She told the court she had used her food dehydrator to process mushrooms for the dish, including dried mushrooms she had purchased, and that she had not known the foraged mushrooms she included were death caps. Several details contradicted her account. One was the plate. Ian Wilkinson, who survived and testified against Erin at trial, told the court that the 4 guests had been served their beef Wellingtons on grey plates. He told the court that Erin had eaten from a plate that was a different colour, an orange tan plate, distinct from the ones given to her guests. Judge Christopher Beale, in his sentencing remarks, accepted Ian Wilkinson's account on this point. The different plate, in the judge's analysis, was consistent with Erin having ensured her own portion was safe, while her guests received the poisoned ones. Another detail was the dehydrator. After the lunch, as her guests became ill, and as people in the community began asking questions about what had been served, Erin disposed of her food dehydrator. She put it in a skip bin at a waste transfer station in Coonwarra. She told investigators she had discarded it because people were accusing her of poisoning the meal and she had panicked. The prosecution described the disposal as deliberate destruction of evidence. A third detail was the children. Before her guests arrived for the lunch, Erin sent her 2 children, who were present at the house that day, to see a film. The children did not eat the beef Wellingtons. Simon Patterson had been invited and did not attend. The only people who ate the beef Wellingtons from the grey plates were the 4 guests. All 4 guests fell ill within hours of leaving Erin's home. By the following day, all 4 had been hospitalised with severe gastrointestinal symptoms. Within days, the hospitalisation had escalated to intensive care. Dom Patterson died. Gail Patterson died. Heather Wilkinson died. Each of them died of acute liver failure caused by Amanita mushroom poisoning, confirmed by toxicological analysis. Heather Wilkinson received a liver transplant during her treatment. She died anyway. Gail and Donald Patterson were both 70 years old at the time of their deaths. Heather Wilkinson was 66. Ian Wilkinson, 68. Survived in an induced coma in intensive care. He recovered. He went on to testify at the trial of the woman who had cooked the meal. Erin Patterson had told people after the lunch that she had also become ill. She presented medical test results that her defence team offered as evidence of her own gastric symptoms following the meal. She told the court she had vomited after lunch and had experienced diarrhoea for several days. The prosecution examined these claims and did not accept that they indicated genuine Amanita poisoning. The pattern of her own reported symptoms did not match the clinical profile of death cap ingestion, and no significant liver abnormality consistent with amatoxin exposure was documented in her medical records from the period. The case attracted immediate and extraordinary media attention, both within Australia and internationally. Victoria Police Inspector Dean Thomas acknowledged publicly that the investigation had been subject to incredibly intense levels of public scrutiny and curiosity by local, national, and international media. The Washington Post covered it, the BBC covered it, CNN covered it, the New York Times covered it, the Los Angeles Times covered it. In Australia, the coverage was total, 5 separate true crime podcasts began analysing the case in real time during the trial proceedings. Several major news outlets ran live blogs, providing moment-by-moment accounts of the evidence as it was presented. The trial had generated what the Australian press described as levels of public interest not seen in a criminal case in the country for decades. Erin Patterson was arrested on November 2, 2023, and charged with 3 counts of murder and 5 counts of attempted murder. 4 of the attempted murder charges alleged she had repeatedly targeted Simon, her estranged husband, in the period before the lunch, but those charges were subsequently dropped. She appeared in the Latrobe Valley Magistrates Court in Morwell on November 3rd and pleaded not guilty to all remaining charges when formally arraigned in May 2024. She had been in custody since her arrest. Corrections officers told the court she was being held in isolation for her own safety and was permitted contact with only one other prisoner. The trial commenced on April 29, 2025, in the Supreme Court of Victoria sitting in Morwell. It ran for 9 weeks. More than 50 witnesses were called. The prosecution was led by Nanette Rogers. The defence was led by Colin Mandy. Rogers told the jury in opening that they did not need to be satisfied about what Erin's motive was, or even that there was one. The evidence, she said, established that Erin had complete control over the ingredients that went into each individual meal portion and had knowingly included death cap mushrooms in the portions served to her guests, while ensuring her own portion was free of them. The defence position was that the poisoning had been a terrible accident. Mandy argued that Erin had developed an interest in foraging for wild mushrooms during the COVID-19 lockdowns of 2020, that she had gathered knowledge about various species, and that the death caps had entered the meal through a labelling error involving mushrooms she had foraged and dried herself without realising what they were. He argued that the individual portions were not sinister, but practical. He argued that Erin's disposal of the dehydrator, while poor judgment, was the action of a frightened woman responding to community pressure, rather than the action of someone destroying evidence of premeditation. Erin Patterson took the stand and testified for 8 days. She was, by every account from journalists covering the trial, controlled and detailed in her account. She acknowledged that she and Simon had had a difficult relationship that had deteriorated significantly in 2022 over child support disputes. She acknowledged receiving the late invitation to Gail's birthday and feeling hurt by it. She said she had organised the lunch specifically to improve her relationship with the wider Patterson family, who she feared were becoming distant because of her separation from Simon. She acknowledged foraging for mushrooms in the Leongatha and Korumburra areas. She said she was not aware that the dried mushrooms she had included in the dish were death caps. She said she had been too embarrassed to tell her in-laws that she had been planning gastric bypass surgery rather than undergoing cancer treatment, which was why she had fabricated the cancer diagnosis. She described the disposal of the dehydrator as a panicked response to community accusations. The jury deliberated for 6.5 days, a length that indicated they took the defence's arguments seriously and worked through the evidence carefully before reaching their conclusions. On July 7, 2025, they returned unanimous verdicts of guilty on all counts. 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder of Ian Wilkinson. The verdicts were unanimous, as required under Victorian law. Erin Patterson sat in the dock between 2 prison officers and showed no visible emotion. She blinked rapidly as the verdicts were read. No family members of the victims were present in the courtroom when the verdicts were delivered. Outside, dozens of journalists gathered around friends of Erin Patterson as they left the building. One friend, Ali Rose, who wore sunglasses and fought back tears, told reporters she was saddened, but that it was what it was. She said she did not know what Erin felt as the verdicts were read. The sentencing took place on September 8, 2025. Justice Christopher Beale sentenced Erin Patterson to life in prison. The non-parole period was set at 33 years. She was 50 years old at sentencing, meaning she will not be eligible to apply for parole until she is 83. Justice Beale addressed the court at length before pronouncing the sentence. He said the substantial planning of the murders and Patterson's lack of remorse meant the sentence should be lengthy. He said the devastating impact of her crimes was not limited to her direct victims. He said her crimes had harmed a great many people. He noted that she had not only cut short 3 lives and caused lasting damage to Ian Wilkinson's health, but had inflicted untold suffering on her own children, whom she had robbed of their beloved grandparents. Beale accepted Ian Wilkinson's account of the different coloured plate as consistent with deliberate separation of the poisoned portions from Erin's own meal. He declined to speculate on her motive, noting that the prosecution had not been required to prove one and had not attempted to. He noted that Patterson maintained throughout the proceedings that she had added foraged mushrooms to the meals by accident. He did not accept this account. The court received 28 victim impact statements. 7 were read publicly. Ian Wilkinson, the only survivor among the 4 guests, had testified at trial, and his statement was among those submitted. The close-knit rural community of Corumburra, where all 3 of the deceased had lived, was described in multiple statements as devastated by the losses. Don and Gail Patterson had been grandparents and community members who were embedded in the fabric of the town, in the way people who have lived in a small place for decades become embedded. Heather Wilkinson had been Gail's sister, part of the same extended family network, present at the family events and the church gatherings and the ordinary occasions that make up the texture of a life in a small Australian country town. All 3 of them had accepted a lunch invitation and had not come home. The prosecution subsequently filed an appeal of the sentence, arguing it was manifestly inadequate. That appeal was ongoing as of late 2025. The defence had also indicated it would appeal the conviction. Both appeals were pending. Erin Patterson's 2 children were present at the house on the day of the lunch. They had been sent to see a film. They did not eat the beef Wellingtons. They are, as of 2026, living with relatives. What they have been told about their mother's conviction and how they are navigating the specific weight of it is not part of the public record. Simon Patterson, who had been invited to the lunch and had declined, gave evidence at trial. He was the man whose parents and whose aunt were killed. He was also the man from whom Erin had been trying to prevent a divorce. He has not made public statements beyond his trial testimony about what the case has cost him. The drive Erin made from Leongatha to Mount Waverley, 118 kilometres each way, to purchase dried mushrooms from an Asian supermarket 3 months before the lunch, was one of the details the prosecution returned to repeatedly. It was an unusual distance to travel for a cooking ingredient in a region that has local grocery options. The prosecution argued it was part of a deliberate effort to source mushrooms from a location unconnected to her immediate community, reducing the traceability of the purchase. Erin said she had made the trip for other reasons and had bought the mushrooms while she was there. The jury heard both accounts across 9 weeks of evidence and 6.5 days of deliberation. Don Patterson and Gail Patterson are buried in South Gippsland. Heather Wilkinson is buried in South Gippsland. Ian Wilkinson recovered from the weeks in an induced coma and returned to Corumburra. He is the only person who sat at that table and drove home afterward. He testified about what he remembered of the lunch, about the grey plates and the different coloured plate Erin ate from, about the hours that followed before the symptoms began. His account, delivered from the witness stand in a Victorian courtroom, was one of the pieces of evidence that the jury found most compelling. The beef Wellington recipe that Erin Patterson chose for the lunch calls, in its standard form, for a single large preparation served communally. She made individual portions. She plated them separately. She served them on grey plates to her 4 guests and ate from an orange tan plate herself. 3 of her 4 guests died. The 4th survived and told the court what colour the plates were. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.